The morning sun beat down on Nellis Air Force Base like a brass hammer, turning the Nevada desert into a shimmering mirage of heat and dust. Inside the main telemetry dome, the air conditioning struggled against the desert furnace while red warning lights blinked across dozens of monitors. The scent of overheated circuits and stale coffee hung heavy in the recycled air. Rachel Martinez clutched a folded printout against her chest, her badge reading Signal Analysis Support in faded letters. The paper's edges were soft from the heat of her sweaty palms, and the waveform printed across it showed something that made her stomach turn. Not chaos, something far worse. Perfect, artificial symmetry that didn't belong to any aircraft she knew. The baseline corruption is internal, she said, stepping forward toward the cluster of pilots arguing around the central display. It's not coming from, we're not crowdsourcing today. Thanks. Major Stevens cut her off without turning around. His tone wasn't cruel, just dismissive, like brushing lint from his uniform. We've got Tier 2 specialists combing through it now. Behind him, Captain Williams glanced at Rachel's badge and smirked. Ghost Tech strikes again. Just let her haunt the back rooms where she belongs. The other pilots chuckled. Someone muttered, she always shows up when the systems crash. Like a bad omen. Rachel's fingers tightened on the printout. She'd seen this pattern before, not in any manual or training simulation, but in her own code. The algorithm she'd developed 18 months ago, the one they'd scrapped during budget cuts. They'd called it too analog, too manual, not viable for modern warfare. But now it was running somewhere in their system, creating a perfect feedback loop that trapped every aircraft signal in an endless echo. The base's entire flight operations had been frozen for 6 hours, and not one of these hotshot pilots could see what was right in front of them. I think you need to check the archived signal protocols. Rachel tried again, her voice barely above a whisper. The pattern matches something from the discontinued Halo Trace project. Major Stevens finally turned around, his face flushed with frustration. Martinez, I don't know what fairy tales you've been reading in your little basement office, but we've got real problems here. Why don't you go run some diagnostics on the coffee machine or something useful? The room erupted in laughter. Captain Williams added, maybe she can fix the air conditioning next. Lord knows she's got plenty of time on her hands. Rachel felt heat creep up her neck, but she kept her expression neutral. These men had never bothered to learn her first name, despite her 3 years on the base. To them, she was just a quiet woman who appeared when computers glitched, spoke in technical jargon they didn't understand, and disappeared back into the forgotten corners of the facility. What they didn't know was that she'd written half-day code that kept their precious jets in the air. What they couldn't see was that their entire operation was about to collapse under the weight of their own arrogance. Yes, sir, Rachel said quietly, folding the printout once more. I'll get back to my diagnostics. She turned and walked toward the exit, her boots silent on the polished floor. Behind her, the arguments resumed, voices rising as the pilots demanded answers from technicians who had no idea what they were looking for. The red warning lights continued their frantic dance, and somewhere in the depths of the base's computer system, her old algorithm hummed along like a patient predator. Rachel descended the narrow service corridor towards Sublevel 4, where the forgotten equipment lived and died in peaceful obscurity. The walls hummed with passive current, and dust gathered in the ventilation, grates like sediment in an abandoned mine. This was her kingdom, the place where obsolete technology went to be forgotten by men who thought innovation meant bigger engines and louder explosions. She paused at a maintenance window and looked down at the flight line. Dozens of F-22s sat motionless on the tarmac, their canopies closed, their systems locked in digital paralysis. Millions of dollars of the world's most advanced aircraft rendered helpless by a ghost in the machine. a ghost she'd created. At the end of the corridor, Rachel stopped at a sealed access panel marked Equipment Isolation. She pressed her palm against the warm metal and smiled for the first time that day. Let them blame hackers and atmospheric interference. Let them call in their Tier 2 specialists and their emergency protocols. She had work to do. The equipment isolation vault beneath Hangar 4 felt like a tomb. Cold concrete walls sweated with condensation, and the only light came from a bank of failing fluorescent tubes that buzzed with irregular rhythm. Rachel sealed the access hatch behind her and breathed in the familiar smell of oxidized copper and electromagnetic fields. This was where forgotten projects came to die. She pulled out a stack of graph sheets marked with red pencil, each one documenting the signal anomalies she'd been tracking for the past 72 hours. The top sheet showed a time series analysis from 2 days prior, the exact moment when the base's systems had started their slow spiral into chaos. Rachel clipped a transparency overlay to the graph and held it up to the light. The pattern was unmistakable. A perfect sine wave that curved too sharply, echoed too cleanly, and repeated with mathematical precision. It wasn't random system drift or atmospheric interference. It was her code, running somewhere it shouldn't exist. She walked to the relay monitor mounted on the far wall and keyed in the local override. The screen flickered to life, displaying a field of scrambled calibration logs. With practiced fingers, she navigated to an archive directory labeled Halo Trace Development. The folder had been marked for deletion 18 months ago, but Rachel had hidden copies in 3 different locations throughout the base's network. She'd known this day would come, the day when their precious automated systems would fail, and they'd need someone who understood the older, more reliable ways of doing things. The Halo Trace algorithm appeared on screen, its elegant code scrolling past like poetry. Rachel had designed it to map blind spots and overlapping radar fields, using harmonic resonance to identify gaps in coverage. It was brilliant, innovative, and absolutely terrifying to military brass who preferred their warfare predictable and controllable. Too analog, she whispered, mimicking Major Stevens' dismissive tone. Too manual, but analog meant human. Manual meant thoughtful. And right now, while their digital systems chased their own tails in an endless loop, our analog solution was the only thing that could save them. Rachel pulled out the aircraft registry and flipped through pages of active aircraft assignments. Every fighter jet, every transport plane, every drone, all of them were trapped in the same recursive signal pattern. Their identification systems couldn't distinguish between real aircraft and digital echoes, so the air traffic control had grounded everything rather than risk mid-air collisions. Everything except one aircraft. Her finger stopped halfway down. The page had an entry marked 15X Echo Block Frame. The notation beside it read, Retired Registry, Manual Flight Only. This particular jet had been deemed too old, too unreliable for modern warfare. Its systems were analog, its navigation manual, its entire operation dependent on pilot skill, rather than computer assistance. In other words, it was perfect. Rachel circled the hangar code in red pencil and folded the page like a treasure map. She'd flown simulation runs in the Echo Block during her training, back when the Air Force still believed in teaching pilots to fly by instinct rather than autopilot. The brass had retired it because it couldn't interface with their precious network systems. But that also meant it couldn't be trapped by them. She gathered her materials, the harmonic analysis key, the signal overlay, the flight manual for the F-15X, and tucked them into her jacket. The vault surveillance system had been malfunctioning for the past 6 months, ever since Rachel had quietly disconnected its primary feed. Amazing how many small system failures went unnoticed when you worked in the forgotten corners of a sprawling military installation. The corridor outside was empty. Rachel's footsteps echoed softly as she made her way toward the lower-level maintenance area. She knew every passageway, every utility tunnel, every forgotten corner of this base, while the pilots and officers navigated by GPS and digital maps. She'd learned these spaces the old-fashioned way by walking them, memorizing them, making them part of her mental landscape. At the intersection near the fuel depot, she paused beside a junction box humming with electrical current. The vibration was too steady, too regular, another sign of the recursive loop that had infected their systems. She placed her palm against the warm metal and felt the artificial rhythm pulsing through the base's infrastructure like a mechanical heartbeat. The pattern was spreading. Soon it would cascade through every connected system, creating a feedback loop so complex that even shutting down the main computers wouldn't stop it. The base would be digitally paralyzed, its personnel trapped in a maze of malfunctioning technology, unless someone broke the pattern from outside the system. Rachel removed her hand from the junction box and continued down the corridor. Behind her, the electrical hum continued its steady rhythm, patient, relentless, and utterly predictable. Just like the men who dismissed her warnings and laughed at her expertise. But she wasn't laughing anymore. The emergency briefing room buzzed with nervous energy as Major Stevens paced in front of a wall-mounted display showing the base's paralyzed systems. Rachel stood near the back, her presence barely acknowledged by the assembled pilots and technicians. She'd been called in as an afterthought, someone to blame if the real experts couldn't find a solution. "Gentlemen," Stevens began, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration, "we're looking at a complete system failure. Every aircraft on this base is grounded, and our telemetry dome is chasing ghosts. I want answers, and I want them now." Captain Williams leaned forward. "Sir, the pattern analysis suggests external interference. Could be enemy hackers, atmospheric anomalies, or equipment failure. We're running full diagnostics on all primary systems." "How long?" Stevens demanded. "Minimum 12 hours, sir. Maybe 24 if we need to rebuild the core protocols." Rachel stepped forward. "Major, I've been analyzing the signal patterns, and I believe Martinez." Stevens cut her off, his face reddening. "I thought I made it clear that we don't need input from support staff right now. This is a crisis situation requiring real expertise." "But, sir, the pattern matches archived code from the Halo Trace project. If we could just—" "Halo Trace was discontinued because it was garbage," Stevens snapped. "Obsolete, unreliable, and completely unsuitable for modern operations. I don't know what fantasy you've been entertaining, but this is real world, not some academic exercise." The room fell silent. Rachel felt 20 pairs of eyes watching her, waiting for her to retreat back to her corner like a scolded child. The heat in her face spread down her neck, but she held her ground. "Sir, with respect, I wrote the Halo Trace algorithm. I understand how it works, and I know how to—" "You?" Stevens laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the concrete walls. "You wrote military-grade software? Martinez, you're a support technician. You run diagnostics on auxiliary systems. You're not qualified to comment on strategic aviation technology." Captain Williams joined in the laughter. "Next, she'll be telling us she can fly the jets, too. Maybe she can fix this with her magic computer skills," another pilot chimed in. "Wave her hands and make all the bad signals go away." Rachel's hands clenched into fists at her sides. 3 years of condescension, dismissal, and casual humiliation crystallized into a single moment of absolute clarity. These men had no idea who she was or what she was capable of. They saw her gender, her quiet demeanor, her support staff badge, and dismissed everything else. "The signal corruption will cascade through the entire network within 6 hours," she said quietly. "When it does, you'll lose not just aircraft communications, but base security, personnel systems, and emergency protocols. This facility will be digitally dark for days, maybe weeks. Stephen's laughter died. Are you threatening us, Martinez? I'm warning you, sir. The recursive loop is already spreading through the power grid. Soon it will affect life support systems, water treatment, food storage. This isn't just about grounded aircraft anymore. The room erupted in angry voices. Someone accused her of sabotage. Another suggested she was trying to scare them into promoting her. Captain Williams stood up, his face flushed with indignation. This is exactly why women don't belong in technical positions, he declared. They get hysterical, make wild claims, try to insert themselves into situations they don't understand. Martinez, you're out of line and out of your depth. Rachel looked around the room at the assembled faces, angry, dismissive, and utterly convinced of their own superiority. Not one of them had bothered to examine her analysis. Not one had asked to see the data she'd compiled. They'd already decided she was wrong because she was inconvenient. I see, she said quietly. Well, gentlemen, I hope your Tier 2 specialists find a solution. Because if they don't, this base will be requesting emergency evacuation by tomorrow morning. She turned and walked toward the exit, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Behind her, Major Stevens called out, Martinez, you're confined to quarters until further notice, and I'm recommending you for disciplinary action. Rachel paused at the door but didn't turn around. Yes, sir. I'll be in sublevel 4 if you need me. She left them arguing among themselves, their voices rising in panic and recrimination. The corridor outside felt cool and peaceful after the toxic atmosphere of the briefing room. Rachel walked slowly, her mind already calculating trajectories and timing windows. They'd given her 12 hours before the system cascade became irreversible. More than enough time to prove exactly who was out of their depth. The abandoned hangar bay stretched out like a cathedral of forgotten aircraft, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadow. Rachel stood before the shrouded form of the F-15X, her flashlight beam cutting through the dusty air. The tarp covering the aircraft was military green, faded to the color of old sage, and when she pulled it away, the jet beneath looked like a sleeping predator. Unlike the sleek, computer-dependent F-22s dominating the active flight line, the Echo Block had the angular, purposeful lines of an earlier generation. Every surface was functional, every component accessible to human hands and human understanding. This was a machine built for pilots who trusted their instincts more than their instruments. Rachel ran her hand along the fuselage, feeling the slight warmth retained from the day's heat. The aircraft's maintenance log, tucked into a pocket beside the cockpit, showed regular inspections but no flight hours in the past 14 months. The brass had retired it not because it was broken, but because it couldn't be integrated into their network-dependent warfare doctrine. Perfect. She climbed the maintenance ladder and settled into the cockpit with the familiar comfort of Anne. Old friendship. The instruments were analog gauges and mechanical switches, not digital displays and touchscreens. The flight manual, dog-eared and annotated with handwritten notes, lay in the seat pocket where she'd left it during her last training flight. Rachel began the pre-flight checklist from memory, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. Fuel, pumps, hydraulic pressure, oxygen systems, electrical connections. Each component responded with the solid reliability of mechanical engineering. No wireless protocols, no network dependencies, no digital vulnerabilities. The startup sequence engaged with a satisfying series of clicks and hums. The heads-up display flickered to life, showing basic flight information in green phosphor text. The radio crackled once, then settled into the steady hiss of empty frequencies. She reached into her jacket and pulled out the harmonic analysis key she'd retrieved from the vault. The small device looked like an outdated thumb drive, its surface scarred from years of handling. Rachel plugged it into the aircraft's diagnostic port and watched as lines of code scrolled across the auxiliary display. The halo trace algorithm uploaded in seconds, its elegant mathematics translating into flight parameters and signal protocols. The system didn't reject. It couldn't reject it, because the Echo Block's operating system predated all the security restrictions that had been added to newer aircraft. Rachel smiled. Sometimes the old ways were the best ways. She activated the aircraft's internal systems and began the signal isolation sequence. The halo trace pattern pulsed once on the wing navigation lights, a brief flash of coded information. That would be invisible to the base's corrupted sensors. As far as the digital systems were concerned, the F-15X didn't exist. The hangar's massive doors opened with a grinding of gears and cables. Rachel had activated them remotely using maintenance code she'd memorized during her first week. On the base, the desert night air flowed into the space, carrying the scent of sage and distant storms. Through the opening, she could see the base's main complex lit up like a Christmas tree. Every building blazed with emergency lighting as technicians worked frantically to contain the spreading system failures. The telemetry dome pulsed with warning strobes, and vehicles raced between structures carrying personnel and equipment. They were losing the battle. The recursive signal loop had cascaded through the power grid exactly as Rachel had predicted, creating a feedback pattern so complex that conventional diagnostics couldn't even identify its source. Soon the cascade would reach critical systems life. Support, water treatment, food storage, communications. The base would be uninhabitable. Rachel taxied the Echo Block toward the hangar entrance, its engine humming with restrained power. The aircraft felt solid beneath her hands, responsive to her touch in ways that the fly-by-wire systems of modern jets never could. This was piloting in its purest form, human skill merged with mechanical precision. She paused at the threshold, between the hangar and the flight line, looking out at the paralyzed base. Somewhere in the command center, Major Stevens was probably screaming at his technicians, demanding solutions they couldn't provide. Captain Williams was likely suggesting increasingly desperate measures, hard resets, system reinstalls, maybe even electromagnetic pulse weapons to clear the corrupted signals. None of it would work. The recursive loop had evolved beyond their ability to understand or control it. Like a cancer spreading through the base's digital nervous system, it would continue growing until the entire facility collapsed into chaos. Unless someone attacked it from outside the system. Rachel engaged the throttle and rolled the F-15X onto the empty runway. The aircraft's lights reflected off the concrete in wavering pools, and its engine note echoed between the silent hangars. She was completely alone, no ground crew, no flight controllers, no safety net except her own skill and the mathematical certainty of the algorithm she'd created. The tower was probably trying to contact her, but the Echo Block's radio was tuned to frequencies that existed outside the base's communication grid. She was flying dark, invisible to their sensors, unknown to their protocols, just the way she wanted it. The F-15X lifted off the runway with the smooth authority of a machine built for one purpose. Rachel felt the familiar rush of acceleration. As the aircraft climbed through the desert night, its engine note shifting to the deeper roar of high-altitude flight. Behind her, the base's lights dwindled to scattered points of illumination against the vast darkness of the Nevada desert. The climb was intoxicating. Unlike the computer-controlled descent of modern fighters, the Echo Block demanded constant attention, constant adjustment, constant communion between pilot and machine. Rachel's hands moved across the controls with practiced precision, her body reading the aircraft's mood through vibrations and sounds that no digital system could interpret. At 15,000 feet, she leveled off and activated the halo trace algorithm. The auxiliary display showed her current position relative to the base's signal. Coverage area, a three-dimensional map of overlapping radar fields and communication zones. The recursive loop appeared as a bright red cancer at the center of the pattern, pulsing with malevolent regularity. Rachel studied the display with the focused intensity of a surgeon examining a tumor. The signal corruption had spread beyond the base's primary systems, reaching into backup networks and emergency protocols. Even if they managed to shut down the main computers, the loop would continue propagating through auxiliary systems until the entire facility was digitally paralyzed. But every system had vulnerabilities. Every network had blind spots. And Rachel had spent 18 months mapping those weak points with mathematical precision. She banked the aircraft toward the north, following a flight path that would take her above the base's primary radar coverage. The halo trace algorithm highlighted the optimal approach vector, a narrow corridor of dead space between overlapping sensor fields. It was a path that existed only in theory, mapped by harmonic analysis and confirmed by her own calculations. No one else even knew it was there. At 25,000 feet, Rachel entered the signal dead zone. The base's corrupted systems couldn't track her here, couldn't detect her presence or predict her intentions. She was a ghost in the machine, invisible to the very technology that was destroying itself far below. The flight computer chimed softly, indicating optimal positioning for the next phase of her plan. Rachel reached for the harmonic resonance controls, her fingers hovering over switches that most pilots had never seen activated. The Echo Block was one of the few aircraft equipped with experimental signal warfare capabilities technology that had been deemed too dangerous for regular deployment, too dangerous for men who couldn't understand its implications. Rachel activated the resonance array and watched as the aircraft system synchronized with the halo trace algorithm. The harmonic patterns she discovered months ago now flowed through the Echo Block's electronic nervous system, creating a perfect inverse of the recursive loop paralyzing the base below. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to shut down the corrupted signal, she would overwhelm it with its own mathematical opposite. The recursive loop would collapse under the weight of its own contradictions, leaving the base's systems free to restart with clean protocols. But it had to be done from exactly the right position, at exactly the right altitude, with exactly the right timing. Rachel pushed the throttle forward and climbed toward 30,000 feet. The aircraft shuddered as it approached its operational ceiling, but the Echo Block was built for punishment. Unlike the delicate, computer-dependent fighters that dominated modern air forces, this machine could handle stress that would tear apart lesser aircraft. At 35,000 feet, she activated the final sequence. The harmonic resonance array powered up with a sound like singing crystal, and the auxiliary display showed signal patterns flowing out from the aircraft like ripples in a digital pond. The halo trace algorithm calculated trajectories and timing, windows with mathematical precision, guiding the harmonic pulse toward its target. Below, the base's systems began to convulse. Rachel could see the effects even from this altitude: emergency lights flickering, communication arrays sparking, the entire facility writhing in digital agony as two opposing signal patterns fought for dominance. The recursive loop was fighting back, trying to adapt to the new threat. But Rachel had anticipated this. She'd spent months analyzing the algorithm's behavior, mapping its responses, learning its weaknesses. She knew exactly how it would react to her intervention, and she knew exactly how to destroy it. The harmonic pulse reached critical resonance at 37,000 feet. Rachel felt the aircraft shudder as massive amounts of electronic energy flowed through its systems, threatening to overload circuits that had never been designed for this level of stress. Warning lights flashed across the instrument panel, and the engine note changed to a higher, more urgent whine. but the Echo block held together. Like its pilot, it was built for the impossible. The pulse struck the base's signal grid with the force of a digital lightning bolt. Every screen in the command center went white. Every radio fell silent. Every computer system crashed and restarted in perfect synchronization. And in the sudden silence that followed, Rachel heard the most beautiful sound in the world. Nothing. The recursive loop was dead. The command center erupted in chaos as systems rebooted throughout the base. Rachel watched from 37,000 feet as buildings flickered back to life, their windows glowing with the steady light of properly functioning electronics. The telemetry dome stopped its frantic strobing and settled into the regular pulse of normal operations. She had done it. The recursive loop was broken, the signal grid was clean, and the base's aircraft were free to resume normal operations. But Rachel wasn't finished yet. The F-15X descended through the desert night like a falling star, its engine note shifting to the deeper growl of powered flight. Rachel switched her radio to the tower frequency and listened to the confused chatter of controllers trying to understand what had just happened. Systems are back online. All aircraft showing green. What was that signal pulse? Unknown aircraft at Angels 37. Major Stevens' voice cut through the confusion like a blade. Tower, this is command. I want identification on that aircraft immediately. Full intercept protocols. Rachel smiled. After 3 years of dismissal and condescension, Stevens was about to get a lesson in respect. She keyed her radio and spoke in the calm, professional tone she'd perfected during countless training flights. Nellis Tower, this is Echo Block requesting landing clearance. An inbound from the north at 25,000, requesting direct approach to runway 27. The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel could imagine the confusion in the tower as controllers tried to identify an aircraft that shouldn't exist, flown by a pilot who shouldn't be qualified. The Echo Block's transponder was squawking the proper codes, but those codes hadn't been active in the system for over a year. Unknown aircraft, identify yourself immediately, came the sharp response. You are not authorized for approach. State your call sign and purpose. Tower, this is Technical Specialist Martinez in the 15X Echo Block. I'm returning from a signal analysis mission. Request permission to land. Another long silence. Then Stevens' voice, tight with barely controlled rage. Martinez, you are ordered to identify yourself and explain your unauthorized use of military aircraft. You are in violation of numerous regulations and will be placed under arrest upon landing. Rachel maintained her descent, the base growing larger in her windscreen. She could see ground crews scrambling to respond to the emergency, vehicles racing toward the runway, and the bright lights of the command center where Stevens was probably having a coronary. Major Stevens, this is Technical Specialist Martinez. I have successfully resolved the signal corruption issue affecting base operations. All systems are now functioning normally. I am requesting standard landing clearance. The radio crackled with interference. Then Stevens' voice returned, each word precisely articulated with fury. Martinez, you are ordered to circle the field until security personnel can be positioned. You will land only when authorized and will submit to immediate arrest. Rachel checked her fuel gauge and calculated her remaining flight time. The Echo Block had enough fuel for another hour of operation, but she didn't need that long. The most important part of her mission was already complete. Tower, I'm declaring a fuel emergency. I need immediate landing clearance on runway 27. It was a lie, but it was also a regulation that trumped all other considerations. The tower had no choice but to clear the runway and authorize her approach. Rachel could hear the frustration in the controller's voice as he granted permission, his professional training overriding the chaos of the situation. The F-15X touched down with barely a bounce, its landing gear absorbing the impact with mechanical precision. Rachel reverse thrust and brought the aircraft to a stop in the center of the runway, exactly where everyone could see her. The base's entire command structure was waiting for her. Security vehicles surrounded the aircraft, their lights flashing. In the darkness, ground crews stood ready with chocks and tie-down cables. And in the center of it all, Major Stevens stood with his arms crossed, his face visible even in the harsh glare of the floodlights. Rachel shut down the engine and opened the canopy. The desert air rushed in, carrying the scent of sage and jet fuel. She removed her helmet and climbed down from the cockpit with the unhurried precision of a pilot who had just completed a routine training flight. Stevens was waiting for her at the bottom of the ladder, flanked by 2 security officers. His face was purple with rage, and a vein pulsed visibly at his temple. "Martinez," he snarled, "you are under arrest for theft of military property, unauthorized use of aircraft, violation of air traffic control protocols, and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline." "You have, Major," Rachel interrupted, her voice calm and professional. "I need to brief you on the signal analysis mission. The recursive loop has been successfully eliminated, and I have detailed telemetry data on the corrective measures implemented." Stevens stared at her in disbelief. "Signal analysis mission? You stole a retired aircraft and flew an unauthorized sortie. You could have been killed. You could have caused a mid-air collision." "You, sir," Rachel said, pulling a folded mission report from her flight suit, "I believe you'll find everything was conducted according to proper protocols." The Echo Block was the only aircraft capable of operating outside the corrupted signal environment. The mission was necessary to prevent complete system failure and potential loss of life. She handed him the report, noting how his hand shook as he took it. Around them, the crowd of personnel had grown quiet, listening to the exchange with obvious fascination. Stevens scanned the document, his face growing paler with each page. The report was flawless, detailed technical analysis, precise mission parameters, and most importantly, documentation of the recursive loop that had been paralyzing the base for over 6 hours. "This is," he began, then stopped. "How did you?" "I wrote the original algorithm, sir. I understand its behavior patterns and knew how to counter them. The base's systems are now operating normally, and all aircraft are cleared for standard operations." The Major looked up from the report, his expression caught between fury and bewilderment. "Martinez, even if this is accurate, you had no authorization to." "Actually, sir," Rachel said, her voice carrying just a hint of steel, "I believe you'll find that technical specialist Martinez has full authorization for emergency system analysis and corrective measures. It's in my job description." She pulled out her official assignment orders and handed them to Stevens. The document was 2 years old, but the language was clear. She was authorized to take any necessary measures to maintain base operational security, including the use of available equipment and resources. Stevens read the orders twice, his face growing redder with each pass. Around them, the crowd of personnel watched in fascination as the Major realized he was trapped by his own bureaucracy. "Sir," Rachel said quietly, "I respectfully request permission to file my mission report and return to quarters. It's been a long day." The base commander's office felt like a courtroom as Rachel stood at attention before the massive oak desk. Colonel Harrison sat behind it, her silver hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights, while Major Stevens paced near the windows like a caged animal. The mission report lay open between them, its pages filled with technical diagrams and signal analysis data that neither officer fully understood. "Technical Specialist Martinez," Colonel Harrison began, her voice carrying the authority of 30 years in the Air Force. "What you did last night was either the most brilliant piece of problem-solving I've seen in my career, or the most reckless violation of protocol in the history of this base. Rachel maintained her position at attention, her expression neutral despite the storm of emotions churning inside her. "Yes, ma'am. I stand by my actions and my mission report." Major Stevens stopped pacing and turned to face her. "Colonel, this woman stole a military aircraft and flew an unauthorized mission. The fact that she claims to have fixed our systems doesn't excuse." "Major," the colonel interrupted, "I've had teams of engineers analyze her report for the past 12 hours. Every calculation is correct. Every technical specification is accurate. The recursive signal loop she describes would have brought this base to its knees within hours." She stood and walked around the desk, stopping directly in front of Rachel. "The question is, Technical Specialist Martinez, why didn't you bring this information to your superiors through proper channels?" Rachel met the colonel's gaze steadily. "I tried, ma'am. I presented my analysis to Major Stevens and his team 3 times. Each time, I was dismissed without consideration. My warnings about the system cascade were ignored, and I was told to return to my diagnostic duties." "She's lying," Stevens protested. "Martinez never presented any formal analysis. She made vague claims about signal patterns and obsolete algorithms. There was no actionable intelligence." Colonel Harrison turned to Stevens, her expression hardening. "Major, I have the security footage from yesterday's briefing. Would you like me to review it?" Stevens' face went pale. "Ma'am, what I saw," the colonel continued, "was a technically qualified specialist attempting to brief her superiors on a critical system failure, only to be dismissed and ridiculed. I saw officers more concerned with maintaining their authority than listening to potentially vital information." Rachel remained silent, but she felt a surge of vindication. For 3 years, she had endured dismissal and condescension from men who couldn't see past her gender and support staff badge. Now, finally, someone was listening. "Furthermore," Colonel Harrison continued, "I've reviewed Technical Specialist Martinez's personnel file. She has a master's degree in electrical engineering from MIT, 5 years of experience in signal analysis and clearance for sensitive projects. She is, by any reasonable measure, qualified to comment on technical matters affecting this base." Stevens opened his mouth to protest, but the colonel silenced him with a look. "Major, you will submit a written report explaining why you failed to investigate Martinez's warnings. You will also recommend appropriate disciplinary action for the officers who participated in dismissing her analysis." The room fell silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning system. Rachel could see the wheels turning in Stevens' mind as he realized the implications of the colonel's words. His career, his reputation, his entire future in the Air Force hung in the balance. "Now," Colonel Harrison said, returning to her desk, "let's discuss the matter of the unauthorized aircraft usage. Technical Specialist Martinez, you took a retired F-15X without proper authorization. How do you justify this action?" Rachel straightened her shoulders. "Ma'am, the Echo Block was the only aircraft on the base capable of operating outside the corrupted signal environment. Modern fighters rely on network connectivity that would have been compromised by the recursive loop. I used the only tool available to complete the mission, and you felt qualified to pilot this aircraft." "Yes, ma'am. I have current flight certification for the Echo Block platform with over 200 hours of logged flight time. My last proficiency check was 6 months ago." Colonel Harrison consulted a file on her desk. "Indeed, you do. In fact, your flight records show exceptional ratings in all categories. Why weren't you assigned to active flight duty?" Rachel hesitated for a moment, then decided on honesty. "Ma'am, I was told that my skills were better utilized in technical support. Major Stevens indicated that combat aviation was not an appropriate role for someone of my ground." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Colonel Harrison's eyes fixed on Stevens with laser intensity. Major, did you recommend against Martinez's assignment to active flight duty? Stevens shifted uncomfortably. Ma'am, I felt that her technical expertise was more valuable in a support capacity. We needed qualified personnel for signal analysis. And you decided that a pilot with exceptional ratings and advanced technical qualifications should be relegated to running diagnostics on coffee machines? The colonel's voice was deadly quiet. Major, are you familiar with the Air Force's equal opportunity policies? Yes, ma'am, but You never what? Never considered that a female pilot might be as capable as her male counterparts. Never thought that technical expertise and flight skills might be complementary rather than mutually exclusive. Rachel watched Stevens crumble under the colonel's withering assessment. For 3 years, she had endured his casual dismissals, his condescending remarks, his systematic exclusion from meaningful assignments. Now, finally, someone with real authority was holding him accountable. Colonel Harrison, Rachel said quietly, I request permission to continue serving in my current capacity. The base's signal infrastructure requires ongoing monitoring, and I believe I can best serve the mission in a technical role. The colonel studied her for a long moment. Technical Specialist Martinez, you just proved that you're one of the most valuable assets on this base. You identified a critical threat, developed a solution, and executed a mission that saved this facility from complete system failure. I'm not about to waste that kind of talent on routine diagnostics. She turned to her computer and began typing rapidly. Effective immediately, you are promoted to Technical Sergeant Martinez and assigned to the newly created position of Chief Signal Analyst. You will report directly to me, with authority over all electronic warfare and signal intelligence operations. On this base, Rachel felt her knees go weak. Ma'am, I thank you, ma'am. Furthermore, the colonel continued, you will maintain your flight status and receive additional training on modern fighter aircraft. I want our signal analysts to understand aviation from both a technical and operational perspective. Stevens looked like he was about to be sick. Colonel, with respect, this sets a dangerous precedent. We can't reward unauthorized actions, regardless of their outcome. Colonel Harrison stood and fixed Stevens with a stare that could have melted steel. Major, the only dangerous precedent here was your systematic dismissal of qualified personnel, based on gender bias. That ends now. She walked to the door and opened it. Major Stevens, you will report to the Base Inspector General's office for a full review of your personnel management practices. Technical Sergeant Martinez, congratulations on your promotion. I expect your first briefing on signal security recommendations. By Friday, Stevens stumbled toward the door, his face pale and his hand shaking. As he passed Rachel, he whispered venomously, This isn't over, Martinez. You think you're so smart, but Major, Colonel Harrison's voice cut through his threat like a blade. That's Technical Sergeant Martinez to you. And I suggest you focus on preparing your own defense rather than making threats against my personnel. Stevens fled the office, leaving Rachel alone with the colonel. The older woman returned to her desk and smiled for the first time during the meeting. Technical Sergeant Martinez, between you and me, this base has needed someone like you for a long time. Too many of our officers think that loud voices and swagger make up for lack of actual expertise. Rachel felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she forced them back. Thank you, ma'am. I won't let you down. I know you won't. Now, about that echo block. I'm recommending it for restoration to active status, with you as its primary pilot. We clearly need aircraft that can operate independently of our network systems. Ma'am, that's not necessary. I'm happy to serve. In whatever capacity. Technical Sergeant. The colonel interrupted with a slight smile. I think you've proven that sometimes the old ways are the best ways. Your combination of technical expertise and piloting skills is exactly what modern warfare needs. Rachel saluted crisply. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. As she left the office, Rachel could hear the sounds of normal base operations resuming. Outside, aircraft engines starting up, ground crews moving equipment, the steady hum of electronic systems functioning properly. The recursive loop was gone. The signal grid was clean, and for the first time in years, she felt like she truly belonged. 6 months later, Rachel stood on the observation deck of the new Signal Analysis Center, watching as the latest batch of recruits practiced formation flying over the Nevada desert. The building hummed with activity technicians monitoring signal patterns, analysts studying electronic warfare scenarios, and pilots learning to integrate traditional flying skills with modern technology. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see the Echo Block parked in its own hangar, its silver fuselage gleaming in the morning sun. The old fighter had been completely restored, its systems upgraded with the latest defensive electronics, while retaining its analog flight controls and manual navigation capabilities. It was a perfect marriage of old and new, much like the woman who flew it. Technical Sergeant Martinez? A young airman approached with a tablet in her hands. The morning briefing materials are ready for your review. Rachel smiled at the fresh-faced recruit. Airman Jessica Thompson was one of 12 female technicians who had been assigned to the Signal Analysis Center in the past 6 months. Word had spread throughout the Air Force about the base that was actually utilizing its female personnel effectively, and applications had poured in from qualified women who had been underutilized at other installations. Thank you, Thompson. How are the new signal protocols performing? Excellently, Sergeant. The harmonic analysis system you designed has identified 3 potential intrusion attempts this week, all of which were neutralized before they could affect base operations. Rachel nodded with satisfaction. The Halo Trace algorithm had been refined and integrated into the base's standard security protocols, creating multiple layers of signal protection that were virtually impossible to penetrate. Other installations were already requesting copies of the system, and Rachel had been invited to brief senior officers at the Pentagon. Sergeant Martinez? Another voice called from across the room. Captain Williams approached with what looked suspiciously like humility. Since the incident 6 months ago, his attitude toward Rachel had undergone a complete transformation. The cocky dismissal had been replaced by genuine respect, and he had become one of her most reliable supporters. What can I do for you, Captain? I wanted to discuss the joint training exercise scheduled for next week. The F-22 pilots are requesting additional practice with analog navigation techniques. They've realized that over-reliance on digital systems can be a vulnerability. Rachel hid a smile. The lessons she had taught with the Echo Block had resonated throughout the entire aviation community. Pilots who had once scorned manual flight techniques were now eagerly learning skills that their predecessors had taken for granted. Set up a series of training flights with the Echo Block, she said. I'll work with each pilot individually to develop their analog skills. And, Captain, make sure they understand that this isn't just about backup systems. Sometimes the old ways are more reliable than the new ones. Williams nodded earnestly. Understood, Sergeant. I'll schedule the first session for tomorrow morning. As he walked away, Rachel reflected on how much had changed since that night 6 months ago. Major Stevens had been reassigned to a desk job at a supply depot in Alaska. His career effectively ended by the investigation into his personnel practices. Several other officers who had participated in the systematic exclusion of qualified women had been disciplined or transferred. The base's culture had undergone a fundamental shift toward merit-based evaluation rather than gender-based assumptions. But the most important change was invisible to casual observation. Throughout the Air Force, the story of Technical Sergeant Martinez and her midnight flight had become legend. Women in technical and aviation roles found their recommendations taken more seriously, their expertise respected more readily, their contributions valued more highly. The ripple effects of that single act of defiance were still spreading. "Sergeant Martinez?" Colonel Harrison's voice came from behind her. Rachel turned to see the base commander approaching with a satisfied expression. "I wanted to personally deliver some news. The Pentagon has approved your recommendation for the Advanced Signal Warfare Academy. You'll be teaching the next generation of electronic warfare specialists." Rachel felt a surge of pride and anticipation. "Thank you, ma'am. When do I report?" "Next month. But first, you have one more assignment here. The Secretary of the Air Force is visiting next week to observe our signal analysis operations. She specifically requested a demonstration of the Echo Block's capabilities. The irony was perfect. A year ago, Rachel had been dismissed as a support technician whose opinions didn't matter. Now the highest levels of military leadership were seeking her expertise. "I'll make sure everything is perfect, ma'am." Colonel Harrison smiled. "I know you will. You always do." As the colonel walked away, Rachel returned her attention to the window. In the distance, she could see a formation of F-22s practicing aerial maneuvers, their computer-controlled flight patterns precise and predictable. They were impressive machines, representing the pinnacle of modern military technology. But parked in its hangar below, the Echo Block waited patiently for its next mission. No computer assistance, no network connectivity, no digital dependencies. Just a pilot, a machine, and the vast sky above. Rachel touched the pilot's wings pinned to her uniform collar and smiled. Sometimes the most important victories weren't won through overwhelming force or advanced technology. Sometimes they were won by quiet persistence, unshakable conviction, and the courage to act when everyone else said it was impossible. The recursive loop was broken, the signal grid was secure, and the sky belonged to those who truly understood it. The ghost in the machine had become its guardian, and the system had learned to trust the human touch. As she watched the morning sun climb higher over the Nevada desert, Rachel Martinez knew that she had found her place in the world. Not as a support technician relegated to the shadows, but as a leader, a teacher, and a pilot who had proven that expertise and determination could overcome any obstacle. The echo of her midnight flight would continue to resonate for years to come, inspiring others to trust their instincts, value their knowledge, and never accept dismissal from those too blind to see their true worth. Sometimes the most important flights happen in the dark, guided only by the certainty that what you're doing is right. And sometimes that's exactly when the sky opens up and shows you where you truly belong. Sometimes the most extraordinary acts happen in silence. Rachel was never asked to lead, never invited to speak, and never given a place in the air she helped protect. But she knew what the system had forgotten. She trusted her own expertise. And when everything else failed, she climbed alone into a retired jet, followed a signal no one else could see, and reset the sky from outside its limits. She didn't break protocol to be noticed. She did it because she was right. This story is not just about flight. It is about quiet conviction, about the discipline to act when unseen, and the strength to never wait for permission. In a world that often overlooks those who speak in data instead of volume, her story reminds us that presence does not need approval. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.